Thank you for the coming. And I'll start my presentation when everyone's ready. I'm going to explain things you need to consider to introduce a personal information de-identification system. And I'm going to explain the steps you need to take to de-identify personal information. I think you heard a lot from similar seminars or public information. So I'm going to focus more on precautions that you might miss and what will happen when you forget to include such considerations. So hope that you can prepare those considerations in advance to effectively manage the identification system. I am Pill-Jun from Fasoo. Nice to meet you all. Today, I'm going to talk about the legal framework related to the identification and the consideration for establishing and maintaining the identification system. I'll be brief in terms of a legal framework, and the first part is laws and regulation related to personal information de-identification. And I'm going to talk about the procedures for personal information processing. And recently, the notice and regulations were revised regarding pseudonymous information. So I'm going to talk about that in this part. And 3 data privacy laws were revised. And the 3 data privacy law include Personal Information Protection Act, Network Act, and the Credit Information Act. And without the approval and the consent of the data subject, now you can use and process personal information. There were personal information breaches, and many developers developed product without reviewing the Personal Information Protection Act, and later they turned out to be violating Personal Information Protection Act. Then later the product should not be sold in the market. So in order to resolve such issues, the 3 data privacy laws were revised. And next, I'm going to talk about the standards to introduce for personal information de-identification system. When you introduce a new system for de-identification, personal information protection products and the processing products need to be reviewed in line with the privacy laws. And according to the Personal Information Protection Commission notice in Article 2, it says Personal Information Processing System is a system that aims to systematically process personal information, including database system. So technical and the managerial measures need to be taken to protect the personal information. According to the same notice, there are the 3 main principles, even though there are many more. The first is access control. And for access control, the approved IP and the accounts and many other conditions need to be considered to have access to the information. So only the authorized access is allowed. Secondly, the prevention of a falsification is needed. Regularly, the access to personal information processing system needs to be checked and audited. And these access records need to be maintained and retained for 1 year. And the third one is very important, is encryption of personal information. And received data and the sent data need to be encrypted. There are encryption requirements in this area, so please refer to the managerial and technical standards to process personal information. So please check the notice. And the next is a standard procedure. And this is the regulation related to the pseudonymized personal information. And there are 4 steps. The first is a preparation step, and there are a lot of questions and inquiries related to the pseudonymization, but these 4 steps are necessary. The first is preparation. Preparation means to clarify the purpose of a processing. Secondly, when personal information is processed as a synonymous information, you need to check whether there are measures in place to ensure the safety of synonymous information. And the second part is actual processing. So a lot of work is done in the second step, and you need to identify what's going to be pseudonymized, and we need to measure the level of risk when the information is pseudonymized. The receiving side needs to be checked. Is it inside? Or the external, the receiver, if the person or organization, the receiving information is outside. You need to check whether it's a public organization or a private organization. And it's also related to the level of processing. If personal information is processed into pseudonymous information, and it depends on the work on the processing. If a lot of information is handled in a unit, when the personal information is identified, it should be used in relation to the other data. However, if there is a risk of a re-identification, you have to apply a high level of the identification processing so that there is no correlation on guess between the 2 data sets. The third is appropriateness review and additional processing. You need to consider the objective of the data use. And if there's no possibility of a re-identification, you can move on to the next step. If the data is appropriate, then you can take out the information outside the boundary and use the data. And if it's not appropriate, then you have to go back to the second stage for actual processing. The fourth step is utilization and the post management. If you are preparing to become a data combining organization, you need to refer to these standards. And the data retrieving and the withdrawal system has been revised, and there are 6 important points to be referred by the data combining organization. In the revised laws, it improved the predictability to be registered as a combining organization. You have to prepare the equipment, the workforce, and the facility before being designated as a data combining organization, and sometimes the approval is obtained, but however, you may be rejected. If you're preparing, first you may submit a plan, then you can make sure that you meet all the requirements to become a data combining organization. And in the plan, it includes the measures to be taken and safety measures. Then it can be a good reference point. You can talk with the government. Then you can start to prepare the equipment, workforce, and facility. And the second important point in the revision is that the combination rate has been changed. You can just use the key value to check the combination rate. Then you can start to combine the 2 data. So first you can check the combination rate. And thirdly, extraction procedure has been introduced for combining personal information data. If there are 10 record sets in company A and 10 different data sets in company B, and you don't have to upload all of the 10, you can just pick the record to be combined. For example, let's say we have 10 records at our company, and 7 of them are subject to combination, and the remaining 3 are not subject to combinations. Then you don't have to send the irrelevant data to KISA. And you can test the combination of the data. So there is a general combination and the pilot combination. If you're preparing to be a data combining organization, you need to prepare the process. And pilot combination is sent by a requesting organization. If there are 100 records and 30 of them are sent as a pilot data, and you try to combine the 30 records first, then you can find the combination rate and analysis of the combination results. And professional organization needs to analyze the results, and you can think that the 30% of the combination is meaningful, then you can go ahead with the rest of the data. And in the revision, pseudonymous information withdrawal and the retrieval regulation have been revised. It is related to a withdrawal review commission, composition, and operation. And the sixth revision point is improve the designation procedures for professional organization and their requirements for personnel and the facilities, but the requirements are less tighter. So there was a requirement for a capital of 5 billion won, but if the public purpose is met, if the public purpose requirement is met, then you can sign up as a combining organization. And the combination, the evaluation, and withdrawal also were the limited scope, but now the scope has been widened, including the analysis. And if you see the details of the revised regulation, I think it can be really useful for you to prepare as a data combining organization. And I'm going to talk about consideration you need to make to build the identification system. I think some of you are considering the new system, and or that you may be operating the system already. Data collection, combination, and processing steps are the major steps, and I'm going to focus on the specific steps that are more important. First is data collection. Sometimes the DB to DB collection is handled, or sometimes you may upload the files manually, and this is an example of a manual uploading. If there is a DB administrator, you're handling information as CSV file, and when you download the file, there are steps to be taken. And in the downloading, the column delimiter is a comma. Then information is separated using this comma delimiter. On the right-hand side, you can see the result. However, the column, you can see the column cannot be distinguished. But this person, the two names can be found, but these are separated using comma. When this information is pseudonymized, when you upload the information, then in the birth date column, you still see a name. You can take it as an exception. However, column data distribution may have an error, and the redundancy risk needs to be considered. So exporting the data and the processing data will be more effective. And next example is a large file transfer. When you send a large file, in the identification system, I mentioned the importance of encryption. Here, you have to encrypt the data. Since it is a large file data, in general, you don't really care the personal information included here, but in this case, you check the integrity and the personal information and character set if it's over 100 gigabytes and 200 gigabytes. If there is a problem, sometimes the transfer is stopped. So you need to consider transfer resume function or the partial transfer of large file data. Then more effectively, the data can be sent to the system, so you need to check those points. So next is the identification processing step. This is a synonymous information processing guideline. A lot of techniques are introduced for the identifying personal information. Basically, so you need to follow these rules as a standard. But when we conduct interviews with many companies, we find that personal information is de-identified without a certain process. And when we review the company's techniques, some techniques are not so standardized. And Korean names are 3 characters and sometimes 2 characters. You need to consider the difference between the 2 cases. And in the English names, sometimes a space is used and sometimes a space is not used, and it depends on the previous techniques and the practices. And the same for address, the email, amount, and the age. And data conversion is sometimes requested. And integrity has to be maintained when you do this. And when personal information is masked or pseudonymized, you cut out the last 4 digits of the phone number. The form and the shape themselves are maintained, but some digits are replaced with random values, like in email or the phone numbers. The phone numbers are changed into the numbers that do not exist. And these are phone numbers that do not exist, so it is no longer personal information. Sometimes the columns are combined or deleted and change the operators in the column data. So there are many techniques to de-identify personal information. When you introduce a new system, so please consider the existing techniques for the identification that the people in your department uses. And the next is unstructured registration data. As I mentioned, there are many ways to pseudonymize data. And so in the RSARS also use the identification method, but in order to meet the legal requirements, and the identification solution is needed. This is how you de-identify. Is it in the number column that you can leave out the last character, and in the birth date you can delete maybe the year or some months. You can delete the last 4 digits of the phone number. However, there's unstructured data, like in the phone consultation memo. So call center agents enter information, and personal information may be included in the call center agent note. Previously, such data is processed with existing method, but it's hard to process unstructured data column in line with the laws and regulation. There are requirements for unstructured data, so please consider and check the related articles. What's effective is to apply the detection rules. Then, according to the detection rules, you can identify personal information. Then, you can mask or delete personal information in these unstructured data columns. Next processing is combination. I don't think you will have a need for data combination in usual case because combining organizations are do the combination work. When data is collected in the combination server, the data is recorded as files, and in the form of files, the combination processing is done, and if necessary, the identification is done. I don't think there is a problem in terms of the solution. However, if you process for combination with a database, sometimes you are faced with two problems. When you upload the file, you need a certain time. The collected data are files, so you have to parse and upload and insert some certain types of a data set. So it's a problem if the file size is too big, and the RDB has some limitations based on the Oracle 10 GB, and the column number is limited to 1000. Let's say the limitation is 1000, and the data to be combined has the 700 columns each. Then, as a result, you need to process 1400. Then it means that this database cannot process the data set to be combined. So if you need to combine the different personal information data sets, please check the number of columns that the servers and database can handle at the maximum. Next is a server resource use. You need to effectively use the server resources. Server resources have to be effectively used. But usually, combination happens at the memory level, and the identification happens usually at the CPU level. So check the memory and CPU capacity. First, the memory needs to be checked. So memory resources are intensively used for the identification. So you upload the files to be combined at the memory level. If memory is 100 gigabytes, but the output maybe 200 gigabytes, then you cannot upload all the data on the server. Otherwise, the server will be taken down. You have to consider ways to upload a lot of data. Usually, split count is used. So the file to be processed needs to be compared with a server. So systems needs to be calculating whether it is can be processed successfully. So memory resources need to be considered. Next is storage disk I/O. I said combination happens at the memory level, and the identification processing is happening at the CPU level, and parallel and the serial processing can quicken the process. However, processed data eventually need to be converted into a file form, then that you can retrieve the data and utilize it. Then tens of and hundreds of gigabytes of data need to be stored somewhere. It takes a lot of time. In red boxes, the disk write speed is emphasized regardless of the speed of the server. I mean here, the writing speed itself needs to be considered. SSD is faster than HDD, and single storage is not an optimal. So please organize a RAID to quickly write disks to store result data. And there are things to be considered to operate the system. So previously, I mentioned how to build the identification system, and this is about the operation. And I prepared the beginner's guide for operating the identification system. So some are familiar with the system. However, there are people who are not really familiar. In this case, you have to understand what techniques need to be applied to which types of columns. If that case, then it will be very useful for the people to get recommendations about how to process the identifiable data, so the users can receive information about whether the information is identifier or quasi identifier, sensitive information or insensitive information. So recommendation is a good way for the beginners to use. Then they can take the recommendation or just partially take the recommendation. I think it's very helpful in the beginning stage. And the second piece of advice is how to maintain the existing de-identification policy. Before introducing a new system, you may have been doing de-identification using SAS or R or DB. So you may be using a lot of tools to de-identify. In this case, the related department or the unit will have a certain rules. For example, so we do process the names with specific techniques, and they will have rules for processing amount in age, email, using SAS. But because of legal situations, the companies are introducing new de-identification system, but you want to link the previous tools to the new system. Of course, you need to apply the existing solutions to the new system. So please check whether the previous techniques are incorporated into the new system then. So that you can prevent any conflicts between the manager and the identification the unit, name, address, and age. You need to process with masking and the delimiter and the in address. You have to integrate the two different column names into one code. And based on the common code, you have to determine how to process this type of personal information. Then you can refer to this standardized policy later on, and while maintaining the existing method and the new system. And next, I want to talk about the repeated and routine de-identification work. Let's say this company repeating the identification the processes from the 9 to 5 every day using the same system and using the same target system and the same techniques. If this is a repeated process, you can start the automatic processing, then there's no risk of missing data, and you can make the work more productive. and we call it batch job. And please check whether the batch job and batch processing is supported by the new system. In my data system, if the identification system is introduced and in my data, there's a source data, and the same data is collected every day to de-identify and put the data into an analysis system. And if it's repeated every day, it's going to be a very effective feature. So when you register the batch job, you can automatically process data collection, the identification, and sending data to another system, and I think it's going to be more effective. And the next part is personal information conversion to provide data to development or test system. When I see my clients, many have their own development system and the testing system. In this test environment, you test with the personal information data, and when it's verified, source code is uploaded in the operation servers. In the development environment, in order to conduct a test, you need data for the server. Then you run the data, and if the output is correct, you can start use the system in the operating server. However, so we cannot use actual personal data in the test environment because it's a violation of laws and regulation. The developers used to make random data, then test environment is not complete. In this case, the identified information is used to test the developed software. Then, so automatic insertion is done after processing personal information. Then you can comply with the regulation and ensure the reliability of the test, and the tested configuration is directly reflected into the actual the server so that you can draw the more realistic dashboard. So if you have a need for testing, so please consider this a feature. In addition, you want to check a lot of analysis indicators to review the appropriateness. If you want to introduce the identification system or want to become a data combining organization, you have to provide data to evaluators for review. So appropriate data needs to be submitted to the evaluators. Sometimes evaluators and auditors are not the internal employees, and they data processing may not be their expertise. So two kinds of data needs to be submitted. Data distribution analysis is the first data. So you provide a chart and make a standard deviation, and top 1% and the bottom 1% data have to be considered. And you analyze the re-identification, the possibility by column. If a assessor reviews the risk, this name has a 99.86% of a re-identification. It means that names haven't been really processed into pseudonymous data. In this case, the names are the only identifier information. And here, there's a birth date is a 3.45% re-identification possibility. If this kind of percentages are provided and the evaluators can review the results objectively, and if the evaluation results are appropriate, you can download the result or insert the database into the database for improvement. So this concludes my presentation on the identification system. Thank you very much for the presentation.